Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're doing great, and I am so glad you've joined me for part 3 of this story because it is such a moving story that you're just going to love. It really touches the heartstrings. So let's continue with part 3 of our story. It all began one unassuming day, when you least expect something strange to occur, and then it invariably does. Me and my wife and our son Oliver were out shopping in Whistler. My father-in-law was sitting comfortably by a fire reading a book. Then he heard a scratching sound at the door. It was very strange, so he quickly went to open it to see what was going on. He discovered a beautiful white dog, resembling a wolf, standing at the door, with a desperate, pleading look in his sad, dark eyes. The dog looked emaciated and thin. He sensed it was asking him for help, as if personally seeking him out. He thought such a fabulous dog had to belong to someone. But seeing the skeletal bones sticking out of the dog's skin so pointedly, like gnarled ropes, it was clear the animal was half-starved. He was grievously concerned about the dog's welfare, so he brought the dog into the house to lie by the crackling fire, and to eat a plate of human food. And that dog ate and ate as if his life depended on it. My father-in-law made some inquiries to find out if anyone was missing this dog, but no one came forward to claim her, and he secretly hoped they wouldn't. He said from the moment he laid eyes on Snow White, he knew that they were like-minded souls going through great anguish together, and in each other they saw a kindred spirit. Chuck did not want to let the dog freeze to death, so he brought her into the house, not caring how we would react to this furry friend. But no one was more delighted than my son Oliver, who thought the dog was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "She looks like the snow, so white. Her eyes are dark, like the ink in my pen. I really like her, Pops. She's the best dog that I've ever seen in my life, and she looks so clever."
"That's because she is clever, Sport. Why do you think she came to the door to ask for help? That's because she is clever."
"Exactly, that's what I say. I knew she was clever." My father-in-law became incredibly attached to his female companion that he chose to call Snow White, because of her white resplendent coat that grew more and more magnificent every day, and also because she came from the brink of death, rather like the character in the fairy tale, after eating the poison apple. She really was magnificent, and looked more like a wolf than a dog. My wife believed Snow White was an angel in dog's clothes, as no one claimed her, despite there even being an announcement about her on the local radio. She appeared out of the blue from nowhere, and she completely delivered my father-in-law from his lugubrious melancholia, as if a dark cloud had been lifted off his life, and in its place a rainbow had arrived. The man who in the past could not be persuaded to walk from the living room to the kitchen unless there was a reward of dinner being served, was now determined to take responsibility for Snow White, who was dependent on him for exercise. So began my father-in-law's regular trips in his white Range Rover to a very stunning location outside Banff, where you can walk up this mountainous elevation on a prepossessing trail, which I gather is very secret. Not many people know about it. Surrounded by exquisite scenic vistas, and it appears to be dog-friendly. This eccentric man, who could barely move a muscle because it was too much like hard work, became fitter and more nimble on his feet, all because he wanted to make Snow White happy and to give her the life she deserved. Such was his devotion and loyalty to Snow White, which was reciprocated 100-fold, for the dog never left his side. It was extraordinary how the heaviness that had formerly swallowed up his joy like a whale had been lifted off him, and he no longer wallowed in his grief and despair, for he had something else to think about beyond his late wife. It would seem Snow White had given him a purpose for living. This gorgeous-looking Arctic wolf-like creature had reached out to Chuck for help, and it was as if he almost forgot about his own dreadful loss by helping out the distressed dog, who needed him, and in alleviating her pain, he'd managed to extinguish his own. In no time at all, Snow White picked up weight, becoming a devoted, loving member of our household, who attached herself to my father-in-law like a barnacle on a rock. It was difficult to tear the two apart, even with the temptation of a stunning steak on offer or a ball being thrown in the basement by Oliver. She was not interested unless it was Chuck presenting her with the steak, or Chuck throwing the ball. I hasten to say that dog loved the bones of Chuck, and knew unequivocally he'd saved her life. So in her eyes, Chuck was her quintessential hero. I hasten to say when someone has a will to live, their health improves exponentially. Chuck's pasty face had become flushed with pink. His eyes, once almost deadened by grief, sparkled with renewed hope. And one day he even agreed to go to the barber's to have his hair cut, and my father-in-law looked decidedly more handsome after that pruning, which involved an old-fashioned close-cut shave, where his long white sideburns that the hairstylist told him had gone out of fashion a long time ago were finally removed. My wife took her dad to McCool's, which is a one-stop shop for all your outdoor gear in Whistler's, and he was kitted out with nifty attire and very robust walking boots, so that he could take Snow White for plenty of outdoor exercise, wearing the right type of gear. In the evening, Snow White would lie across Chuck's legs while he was reading, like a long, furry foot-warmer, and soon became an invaluable member of our family, loved by us all very dearly. He was also a comedian, much like my father, making us laugh all the time, as if by hanging around Chuck, he'd also picked up some of his quirky characteristics. When she was hungry, she'd pick up her food bowl in her mouth and drop it on my father-in-law's lap. She would sit there on her haunches, her dark eyes fixed on him, patting him on the knee with her paw. My father-in-law would pretend not to notice, so she'd lift the food bowl off his lap and throw it on his feet to get his attention. Once again she would pat his knee with her paw, as if to say, "Go on, don't be so lazy. Are you going to feed me or not?" My father-in-law would throw down his book and say, all right, Snow White, food is on its way." And he would trudge over to the kitchen to fill up Snow White's bowl with pellets. And once she'd gobbled it all up, she'd pat him with her paw again to say thank you. The bond between man and dog took my breath away. It was beautiful to watch. I'd never seen such devotion before. My father-in-law became friendly with all the locals in town, who loved him and his quirky sense of humour. In Whistler he was known as the debonair man with the white hair, who went everywhere with his white dog. It was easy for my father-in-law to gain that debonair reputation, after, of course, shedding all that walrus-like blubber from the past. I had built some asphalt bicycle paths on our property, so that my son Oliver could cycle around to his heart's content, without worrying about any oncoming traffic, and the relief that this little exercise brought my wife was immeasurable. She believed our move to Banff was serendipitously preordained, and that the universe had given us one warning to move after my son had experienced that fortuitous accident on his bike. "I don't know, Robert," she told me, "but there was a distinctive voice in my head that said if you don't leave Montreal, then the next time this happens, your son might be killed." I knew the voice was right, as our son is so obstinate, at the very best of times, and impulsively makes decisions that later on he regrets. And I knew the same accident could happen again, but this time our Oliver would never escape with his life. Twice lucky, I don't think so. I had to pay attention to that inner voice, which is why we came here. My wife would walk to the ends of the earth if it meant saving her son's life. She told me her mother had always taught her to listen to that intuitive nudge, because it was always important and should never be ignored. She told her daughter that the day she left Sylvia the cat out in the snow overnight, a voice in her head told her to leave the window open a little, but she thought that was crazy, and Sylvia nearly froze to death as a result. If her mother had left the kitchen window slightly ajar, Sylvia would have got into the house easily, and not moved to the old lady's house next door, as the idea of being left out in the snow again was not acceptable for the poor cat. For me personally, I was very happy to be enjoying a brand new life in Banff, and certainly did not miss my old job in Montreal, nor the hunky old calendar of the firemen staring at me from 9 to 5 every day. There were far more attractive things for my eyes to be feasting on, and the scenery in Banff was certainly one of those things. I had already taken tourists on hiking trails with great success, and my wife's fear of my becoming a redundant layabout amounted to nothing. Soon I was encouraging my father-in-law to regularly come fishing with me, to go here, to go there, and he was becoming alive, rather like a strangled orchid whose roots has been stuffed in a tight container for a very long period of time, suddenly being released and being able to breathe again. Once those dying, distressed roots are loosened from their tangled confinement. It was miraculous to observe the dramatic but beautiful transformations in my father-in-law, which no one welcomed more than my wife. "Did I not tell you, or did I not tell you, it would be great if my dad moved in with us? He's such a lovable teddy bear, isn't he? Our household has become so complete, and Oliver simply adores his grandfather, who reads to him, tells him stories all the time. And what little boy doesn't adore a big white fluffy dog to cuddle up to? I believe if my father had not moved in with us, he'd be deceased by now. I don't just think it, I know it. These days he's balanced his excessive reading with physical exercise. He's no longer on high blood pressure medication, and looks better and younger than he's done so in years. I don't think he would be here, and I mean that, Robert, if he hadn't moved in with us. And I believe our sacrifice has turned out to be our biggest blessing. I've never felt so close to my father as I do now. It seems so natural to be living together 3 generations in one family. I think I'm beginning to understand, Robert, why some Mediterranean families live together. Grandparents and grandchildren alike. It actually works. When I listen to my father talking to our son, giving him such wizened advice from such an old soul, I can see our son is more mature than most in his year. My father has taught him so much. That's why the elders in some cultures are highly esteemed for their sagacious wisdom, you know. Do you know his teacher says he's so advanced for his year? And I think he has his grandpa Chuck to thank for that. One day, little did I know that this day would not follow the usual trajectory of all the previous days, and that something rather peculiar was about to transpire. When a fortuitous event you don't see coming arrives on the scene, no one is prepared for it. It's a little like planning a party, and never for a moment had you anticipated rain, but the rain comes, and it throws all your plans out of the window like an apple core on the side of the road. The day had started much like any other, and that was the way I thought it would end, with the usual family routines coming into play. But that is not what happened. It was autumn and a particularly beautiful time of year in Banff, for some of the trees were bedecked with a confetti of gold, red or amber leaves, and against the blue sky and the green rolling countryside, it was a feast for the eyes. It was in the late afternoon that my father-in-law Chuck Fournier decided he'd take Snow White for a walk at their favourite spot.
"I've been a bit lazy today," he told me. "The novel I was reading, well, it was so gripping. I simply couldn't put it down. But Snow White has been very patient with me all day, and we both need some fresh air and exercise." "Look at the time, Chuck," I said gingerly. "Are you sure that this is a good idea? I don't mean to put a spanner in the works, but it's nippy outdoors now. It's getting dark early. You don't want to find yourself getting caught up on a hiking trail at this time, especially if it gets dark." "Look, Robert, you're sounding exactly like my daughter. Will you relax? I'm not going to be long. We're just going on the hiking trail that I always take every day. Snow White loves it there. I'm not going to deprive her of that. We just won't be gone for as long as I usually am, but we'll be back before it gets dark. I'm quite sure, Chuck, that Snow White here will forgive you if she misses out on just one walk. I personally think it's ridiculous to venture out now. I'm sure all the locals in Whistler would agree with me and advise you not to walk so late in the day, especially in autumn when it gets dark quickly." My strong-willed father-in-law was as wilfully obstinate and headstrong as my wife. I knew there was no arguing with him, as the stubborn, obdurate streak in the Fournier family line had been inherited by my son Oliver. I knew all about dealing with intractable, doggedly inflexible people who are resolutely bull-headed about something.
If you try to persuade them any different and ask them to listen to you, they'll become contrary and even more iron-willed and unbending. I decided to let my father-in-law make his own decisions for himself. I could not dictate his life choices. It wasn't my place to do so. I watched him put on his puffer jacket, his scarf around his neck, and his walking boots on his feet. He gave me a nod and said, "See you soon, Robert. As I told you, I won't be gone for terribly long." Then Snow White, with her tail wagging happily, bounded after him, letting out a couple of delighted woofs and giving me a look as if to say, "My master would never ever let me down, not like you. I'm going for walkies." I watched the white dog diving into the passenger side seat of Chuck's Range Rover, and they drove away. I'm not a superstitious person, served with an intuitive mindset like my wife is, but I will say this. Something did not feel right about my father-in-law leaving for a walk at this late time of the afternoon. It left me with chills running down my spine and an unsavoury bitter taste polluting the back of my throat. But there was not a damn thing I could do about it. It was a pity my wife was in Banff, having attended a pizza party with Oliver and friends. If she had been home, she'd have persuaded her father not to go out for this walk, because one stubborn person talking to another is far more effective than anything else I know. It's as if they know how to break down the barriers of this unyielding war of willfulness that is so typical of my father-in-law. Why did I have an overwhelming feeling that he would get himself into trouble? I wished to God the feeling would leave me, but it clung to me like sticky chewing gum that you cannot easily remove, leaving me feeling decidedly apprehensive. I was soon to learn that I had a lot to be apprehensive about. Chuck's account. When my wife died, I really thought my life was over. I stopped eating. I no longer drowned my sorrows in cans of beer, as you might expect I would. I had reached the startling revelation that I had nothing left to live for. I was quite happy to die, and I reached a peace about it. I didn't want to go on with my life if it meant living without her, and I'm sure many men who've lost their wives in similar circumstances understand where I'm coming from. When my daughter began to insist that I move to Banff and live in the home they purchased, I thought it was a very bad idea. I certainly did not want to impose on my daughter's kindness, and nor did I want to live any more, although I did not wish to share this sorry information with her, as that would have made her very sad. That was the way I felt. Moving in with them would mean I'd have to make some kind of an effort to do my part in reading to my grandson Oliver and helping my daughter around the house. I didn't want any of that. I just wanted to curl up and die. I was happy with that choice. Without my wife, without her cute smiling face, the big dimples and lively personality, what did I have to live for? Nothing. I just wanted to fade away like the summer flowers at the end of the season. I was ready for that and had no fear of death. As like the perennial flowers, I knew I would be back, with a much more nimble body next time, and hopefully my wife would be in the picture again. I had been a very well-read man all my life, and I'm afraid I lived a very sedentary lifestyle, doing the bare minimum with my wife, who shared in my lazy tendencies. But we were like two happy Teletubbies, enjoying the sanctuary of our home together, which in the early years of my children's life, I'm ashamed to confess, was the most derelict house in the neighbourhood due to my neglect and my inability to leave a good novel behind to attend to some grass that decided to grow offensively long. On the outside, our home looked a sorry bedraggled sight in our neighbourhood, but on the inside it was a cosy den that could get a little untidy at times, as I was useless with housework, and I wouldn't be the remotest bit offended, but there you go. It distressed me that my obsession with reading and watching sport on the box, along with drinking so many beers, had done this to both of my kids. My father told me on his deathbed that he didn't want to leave me his vast fortune, as I was predisposed to being lackadaisical, and he was right about that. All my father's money meant was that I had the freedom to do what I liked, which was so liberating, but probably not in a good way. I could hibernate in my home like a very contented black bear. Do I regret it? Not really, as strange as that may sound. I lived my life very contentedly through my books. I also thoroughly enjoyed my interactions with my beloved wife and children, who made me smile all the time, and I thoroughly enjoyed the company of friends. You can live a very fulfilled life from your sofa if you keep yourself mentally stimulated. But my body was retaliating from my couch potato lifestyle, and my doctor had told me as much.
If you don't move a little more, Mr. Fournier, you will be joining your wife in an early grave.
My blood pressure was through the roof, and even the medications I was taking would only adjust the blood pressure readings by a small amount. They were still insanely high. At the time I was overweight, with a stomach that hung over my pants that was so large it seriously looked as if I was about to give birth to triplets. But after my wife died, I shed the weight effortlessly easily, along with the beer gut, as my desire to eat had died with my wife. When I moved into the mansion in Whistler, with my daughter, her husband and Oliver, I was almost certainly arrested by the spectacular views that stirred up my dying, defeated spirit, making me realize that there really was life beyond my wife's death. But I was still in that very dark, foreboding, depressing place. But that was all about to change, in a fortuitous way I never envisaged possible, with a serendipitous event that I believe shook me out of my lugubrious melancholia. And it helped me to stop feeling so dreadfully sorry for myself. One day when my daughter, her husband and my grandson Oliver had been invited to dinner with one local in Whistler, I had rejected the invite. I still wasn't in a good place and needed some time to myself. I was sitting by a warm fireplace in the living room, and I heard the scratching sound while I was reading a novel, even though the fire in the grate was crackling and spitting away heartily. The scratching sound was isolated and very distinctive. It got my attention at once. I stopped reading and listened attentively. The scratching continued, and it was accompanied by a whining sound. What the hell, I thought. What on earth is making that sound? It was beginning to annoy me ever so slightly, so I plonked my book down on the coffee table, with a bookmark to secure the place. I rose out of the couch and followed the sound down the passage to the front door. I opened it curiously, and outside the front door was a dog, who looked much more sorrowful than I did, and my heart reached out to her. She was magnificently beautiful, but so emaciated, with her ribs jutting out of her coat like wiry coat hangers, and her white hair was matted and dull. Those black eyes stared at me pleadingly, and I knew this dog was reaching out to me for help. How could I possibly turn her away? I wanted to save her more than anything else in the world. I wanted to help her get flesh on her bones, and give her a warm, comfortable place to sleep. In that moment my attention was diverted away from my miserable self towards something else worthy of my attention, that clearly needed my help, and an unlikely bond was born between the both of us that I never saw coming. In that moment I was like a candle wick that had been smouldering as it started to die out, but now the flame on the wick had been reignited. When your life has no purpose, you're as good as dead, but when you find a reason to live, then you want to thrive, and the idea of dying loses its appeal very fast. I decided to call my dog Snow White, because Snow White nearly died of eating a poison apple in the fairy tale. And in my dog's case, the poison was her impoverishment, her starvation, her inability to find somewhere warm to sleep. But in finding our home, in finding me, she was delivered from her deadly plight, like when the prince found Snow White and kissed her back to life again. I hasten to say, when no one claimed Snow White, I did ponder where on earth she'd come from. But this dog saved my life, more than I actually saved hers. But together we were kindred spirits that could relate to each other's pain. It was on an autumn afternoon I got very involved in a novel I was reading, not so much for the content, but simply because it was so well written. It had me on the edge of my chair, and was significantly hard to put down. These days not many novels had that kind of power over me, but this one had me hooked. I had to find out who the murderer was, although I almost certainly knew. I had my sneaky suspicions it was a woman called Abby, who had been giving her victim the evil eye for many long years, and wanted to kill him, for she had a secret interest in the man's wife, and wanted him well out of the way. But tragically for her, the man's wife had no affection for Ebby, and was not that way inclined. The clock began ticking away, and Snow White, who was lying across my feet, kept glancing up at me in anticipation, with that hopeful, eager look in her dark eyes. "Are we going for a walk or not?" I had fortunately become very fit since Snow White had entered my life. I had discovered a prepossessing hiking trail on a slight mountainous incline, where you walked through a wood grove until you got to the top of this mountain, and you could look down on the valley below, over exquisite views onto a turquoise lake, almost as enchanting as Lake Louise, but a whole lot smaller, of course. One of the locals in Whistler confided in me about this hiking trail, swearing me to secrecy. "Don't tell anyone about it," he told me. "I don't want tourists to find out about this place. It's our little secret," he said, tapping his nose. I have no idea why he had confided in me about this location, but I had taken my son-in-law on the trail, and he agreed it was absolutely incredible. There are no words to describe its ambience, its serenity, and sheer beauty. It was such a tranquil paradise that was simply postcard perfect. So I won't even bother to try and tell you how bewitching it was, for words fail to epitomize its sheer magnificence. And certainly during the autumn months, so many of the trees were richly bedecked in resplendent garlands of gold and red leaves, and it was absolutely breathtaking. Snow White, with her spirited energy and rambunctious enthusiasm, thoroughly enjoyed venturing up this mountainous trail, appearing to love it as much as I did, as there was always new scent signatures for her to explore. I climbed out of the upholstered chair with a measure of reluctance. The fire was crackling away merrily in the grate. It was rather difficult to squirrel myself away from such luxurious comfort, especially when it was so warm and cosy inside the house. But with Snow White eager to go for a walk, how could I refuse her? How could I let her down? My son-in-law Robert was at the desk in the lounge, making some notes. He looked up at me with a frown developing between his brows, when he heard me call out to Snow White, "Are you coming, girl? We're going for a walk. Coming?" "Where are you going, Chuck?" he asked me. "It's nippy out there. It'll be dark soon. Why would you take Snow White out now? Let her go for a run in the yard, but you don't need to go walking with her." "Oh, but I do," I told Robert. "I won't be long. I remember reading somewhere that even if you take a dog for a 10-minute stroll, as opposed to half an hour, they won't even know the difference, but they'll feel as if they've gone out." I knew, of course, my son-in-law was right, but I never liked to give him the credit when it was due. Instead, I liked to be obstinate. It seems to be a natural instinct of mine. It would get dark soon. The weather was chilly, but I would be quick, and try as he might to discourage me, he couldn't persuade me to change my mind. Soon I was in my white Ranger, with Snow White sitting opposite me, with her long nose smudging the passenger side window as she peered out at the landscape. Before long we arrived at the parking area outside the trail, which was empty, as no one knows about this marvellous place, even hardened locals who have lived in Whistler for many long years. So I was privileged to bring my dog here. The moment I parked the car, Snow White began to wag her tail furiously and let out a couple of excited woofs. I opened the door for her, and she bolted past me. Moments later we were ambling at an increased speed down the earthen trail, where on every side we were surrounded by tall, lofty trees, some elegantly swathed in exquisite leafy overcoats of gold, red and amber. My walking boots were beating briskly against the decaying leaf litter, some that was so dried up and crunchy it sounded like a packet of chips being smashed beneath heavy soles. Snow White had her attentive, discerning nose pinned to the earthen floor, as she pilferaged the trail for any exciting scent markings that aroused her interest, and as usual she seemed riveted and fully absorbed. She looked at me through dark, soulful eyes, and woofed a couple of times, as if to say, "Wouldn't you like to know?" Then she ebulliently scooted ahead of me. The trail looked much as it had done any other day of the week, but being later on in the afternoon was even more transfixing, as the golden glaze of the sun beginning to set over the valley was breathtakingly beautiful, and the earthen floor was covered with a confetti of golden leaves that was mesmerizing at this time of the day, under the ethereal light of the late afternoon. I decided I could be no more than 15 minutes on this trail. I would need to head straight back. I resigned myself to the unfortunate fact that, as usual, my son-in-law was absolutely right, and if I didn't make tracks back to the car soon, when the light was waning, I could easily get caught up in the dark. I guess I had not bargained on a faithless son, being so hell-bent on letting me down, by retiring fast, reticently shrinking into the shadows, as if hiding her light under a bushel, and only intent on staining the sky for a few fleeting minutes, in a rich kaleidoscope of golds, tangerines, and oranges, then shrinking subserviently behind the clouds. It was as if in 1 minute the sunset was there, and the next minute those pretty colours were confiscated by a smouldering grey colour, as the dingy twilight was beginning to roll in, with an assiduous determination that could not be thwarted. I was feeling bitterly disappointed. I was so invigorated, refreshed, and thoroughly enjoying the fresh air blowing against my skin, and the feeling of stretching my stiff legs. But now I really needed to head back, because I did not want to be wrestling with the gloomy oppression of a dark night, and with only a tiny torch in my jacket pocket, fumbling around in the darkness and navigating my way through this woodgrove would not be an easy task. The wind stepped up its speed and whistled through the trees vigorously. Branches were swinging up and down rather precariously. The breeze whipped up gold autumn leaves like celestial butterflies that brushed past my skin. And that was when I heard a baby crying. My first thought was, oh my God, someone has dumped their baby in this woodgrove, and this poor little mite would never survive the night. It could be anywhere. I'd recently read a true story of a woman who abandoned her baby in the woods. The baby was looked after overnight by wolves. Then the pack leader of the wolves led a kind farmer to the baby, and he adopted her as his own little girl. It was ironic, as the previous summer this farmer had lost his 1-year-old baby to SIDS, which is known as sudden infant death syndrome, where a baby dies for no medical reason at all. When the farmer discovered this baby, his broken heart began to recover, as it represented a green shoot of recovery in his life. No one knew who the mother was, and she was never found, and why she abandoned her child, that remains a mystery. I became very concerned for the baby's cries in the woodgrove, that sounded much like my babies had done when they were little. I felt grievously angry with the mother, whoever she was, for being so negligent and selfish. I couldn't just turn around and go back home, or I'd be worrying about this baby. It was as if Snow White had read my mind, because she began to run through the woodgrove with me tagging behind her, as if she knew exactly where we would find this abandoned child. I had images of a teenager giving birth in a toilet cubicle, and coming out to the countryside to leave the baby for the wild animals to eat. You would think that that kind of preposterous thing would not happen these days. But stuff like this still goes on behind closed doors. But most of us don't know about it. And all over the world, abandoned babies are left in all kinds of precarious places, in the hope they might be found by a random stranger. But out here, there were no chances of that happening. Maybe with DNA profiles so good these days, the mother wanted her baby gone for good. You never know what goes on inside people's heads. I won't deny I was intimidated by the gloomy sky that hovered over my head and steeped through the trees, the colour of black tea. It was as if someone was gradually turning down the dimmer switch, so it was slowly growing darker and darker and darker. Snow White bounded towards a distinctive sculptural tree with branches that opened up like a mother's warm hug. And that was when I saw a bundle lying in the tree branch, in a woven basket covered in a deer pelt. I removed the basket from the tree, thinking that I was caught up in a similar situation as Moses in the bulrushes, when that Egyptian woman discovered little Moses lying in a basket, only this basket was contained in a tree and not floating above the water. The baby was howling, and I pulled it out of the deer pelt, and to my amazement discovered it was covered in hair, but it had a very cute human face and bright brown eyes. Is this why the mother had abandoned her child, I wondered, She recognized that her son was not like normal babies and had a physical impediment. The baby was born with way too much hair. But there were things that could be done with problems like that these days. I had heard about this condition before. I didn't doubt for a moment that the baby was human. I rocked it tenderly in my arms. Snow White licked her little face, and the baby immediately stopped crying and began to gurgle happily. Truly it was one of the cutest babies I have ever seen, despite her physical impediment. I then picked her up in the basket and carried it down the trail, wondering what kind of reaction I'd get from my daughter and her husband when they saw the hairy little mite that I brought home with me. I was getting good at picking up abandoned strays. I was wondering if I might be able to persuade my daughter to adopt the poor little thing, as in my advancing years I would not be in a good position to take on such a responsibility. But we did have the financial means to afford the finest doctors for the little child, who could address the problem with hair. But this little mite deserved to have a promising future, and the mother abandoning her child like this was disgusting as far as I was concerned. As these thoughts rolled through my head, I suddenly heard heavy feet pounding the ground. It sounded as if a cantankerous rhino with an axe to grind was charging towards me. The ground wobbled, heaved, vibrated under its powerful thrusts. My first thought was, what the hell is that? The woodgrove suddenly became eerily quiet, as the crickets and frogs that had begun their cheerful chorus suddenly became cloyingly mute. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up on end, and I knew something was terribly wrong. My heart began to flutter violently in my chest like a terrified bird, and every single cell in my body was screaming, "Run, Chuck, run!" But my legs were weighed down by blocks of cement. As I tried to pick up speed, I felt as if I was clawing my way against an invisible wall of resistance, as if hands I could not see were anchoring me firmly to the ground. A feeling of impending dread overwhelmed me, and I could swear a voice echoed through me, screaming, "No! No! No!" Snow White began to growl, and the hair on her back doubled up in size, so she looked absolutely enormous. She was glancing behind her, with a look of fear on her face, as if she could pick up a foreboding energy on the wind that she did not like. Something was after us, and whatever it was big, it was predatory, it was dangerous. For a moment I saw my life flashing before me, as I anticipated that this was it for me, and in that moment the death I had so longed for, I denied, for I realized more than anything I wanted to live. I could sense the predator before I actually saw it, and I knew I was in grievous trouble, and this poor little baby in the basket didn't stand a fighting chance. I was doomed. We were doomed. The next thing I knew was a stone went flying in my direction, and I heard a loud, frantic scream. It was almost disembodied, hauntingly scary. The stone was huge, missing me by mere inches. I turned around to see this giant hairy woman that I knew at once was a Bigfoot. She stood up on 2 feet, covered in cinnamon-colour hair, with a white patch under her chin. She was robust, powerful, mighty, her body nimble, dense with muscle. She looked so intimidating, standing up at 9 foot tall and probably 800 pounds, and I don't doubt for a second she would have the strength to lift up a car. That's how powerful she was. But this hairy lady was not pleased with me. She was oscillating her arms at me furiously, waving them around in indignation, screaming at me in a strange language. "Kilakikwa! Kilakwika! Kilakwikwa! Homakilaki! Homakina!" She began to run towards me. I think she said, "What are you doing with my baby? What are you doing?" I couldn't react in time. I was so bemused, so startled by what I was observing. The next thing I knew, she'd grabbed me violently and thrown me off the ground. She hit me with a fist on the side of my head, and everything went black. If she'd intended to harm me, she could have inflicted greater damage, but she just knocked me out. The way she reacted was very natural for an affronted mother. I'm really surprised she did not kill me, and thankful for that too. I'm not sure wearing her shoes I would have been quite so considerate in the circumstances, as it seemed as if I was abducting her baby. I am glad to say my son-in-law found me in the woodgrove with Snow White lying over my body to keep me warm. That's how faithful and loyal my dog was. I was concussed for a day or so, and when I remembered what had happened, I was angry with myself for not realizing that this creature was not a human baby, but it had looked so human in every way. I returned to the woodgrove to make amends. I left a huge basket of treats for the female Bigfoot. I have continued to take that hiking trail, and on one occasion I saw a female Bigfoot, who looked up at me and nodded, and then glided away. So I do think I've made my peace with her. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. My word, can you imagine finding a baby Bigfoot in the woodgrove and you actually think it's human, and you find out that it's actually not, and you're greeted to a very angry female Bigfoot. Personally, I'm surprised she didn't kill him, because I think even a human mother might do the very same when you think someone's abducting your baby. Wow, what an extraordinary story. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Until next time, goodbye and good night.